I thought what we'd do tonight is I'd talk about the book on Justice Scalia, which I've just finished, talk a little bit about where the court is at, and then take questions to see what you'd be interested in having to do with this court, having to do with journalism, anything going on in Washington. And then, as Jeffrey Blaffett said, that you all will have access to the book, and I will sign it to you or whoever you want to have it signed to. I want to also thank Jeffrey and Sheila for all the work that they've done arranging this. I also want to thank President Janet Riggs for having me here. Acknowledge also Ken Mott and Eileen Stillwagon, affiliated with the program too. And thank you all for coming out on a cold night. And we almost did keep it last Thursday. And it was at the very last minute when I think there was no way that anybody could have gotten through my Washington, D.C. street without airlifting me here that, that we decided to postpone. So thank you for being here tonight. It's actually very good timing to be here tonight, so soon after the Supreme Court's ruling in Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission. In that 5-4 decision, as many of you know, the court struck down limits on corporate campaign spending and opened the door to much more money in elections. The majority decision was written by Anthony Kennedy, of course, yet Citizens United, a case that's gotten almost as much attention as Bush v. Gore these days, is an example of the success of my subject, Justice Antonin Scalia. Now, the majority opinion, as I said, was written by Anthony Kennedy, but in Justice Stevens' dissent from the bench, very halting, passionate dissent from the bench, and in his written opinion, he took specific aim at Justice Scalia, who was essentially the architect of the views that prevailed last month. As Justice Stevens wrote at one point, all of the majority's theoretical arguments turn on a proposition with undeniable surface appeal, but little grounding in evidence or experience. Quote, that there is no such thing as too much speech. Now that quote is from Justice Scalia's dissenting opinion in the 1990 case that was overturned by the Citizens United rule. And what Justice Stevens went on to say was, in the real world, as we have seen, corporate domination of the airwaves prior to an election may decrease the average listener's exposure to relevant viewpoints, and it may diminish citizens' willingness and capacity to participate in the democratic process. And then Stevens specifically attacked Justice Scalia's idea that there can never be too much speech, and he wrote in a footnote about the supposed value of plentiful speech. Of course, no presiding person in a courtroom, legislature, classroom, polling place, or family dinner would take this hyperbole seriously. And I thought that's interesting, the idea that Scalia, father of 9, thinks there's nothing better than too much speech. But you figure at his dinner table, I presume he controlled it. I was also reminded, as the Supreme Court majority gave short shrift to Congress in last month's decision, of something Justice Scalia had said during oral arguments in the case when it was heard last September, and overall in his view of the legislative branch. Quote, Congress has a self-interest, he told U.S. Solicitor General Elena Kagan at one point. We are suspicious of congressional action in the First Amendment area precisely because we, at least I, doubt that one can expect a body of incumbents to draw election restrictions that do not favor those incumbents. Now, is that excessively cynical of me? Scalia asked. I don't think so. Well, I would respond, maybe. And that leads me to the subject of the first part of my talk, Justice Scalia's idea of Washington and his idea of Congress. As many of you know, Justice Scalia has cut his teeth in Washington in the Nixon and Ford administrations. In fact, are there many students here from the executive branch seminar? You'll see that a lot comes back to his formative years in the executive branch, first with President Nixon and then with President Ford. He was there in the post-Watergate era, and he developed a real antagonism for Congress. He was constantly testifying on behalf of executive privilege and against disclosure of White House documents. He sparred repeatedly with Edmund Muskie of Maine and U.S. Rep. Otis Pike of New York and U.S. Rep. Father Drinan of Massachusetts, all Democrats trying to pry information from the executive. I found in my research for American Original that Scalia's experience in the 1970s led him to enduringly value executive power and to consider Congress the enemy. Justice Scalia was formally installed as an Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Counsel in August of 1974. This was only a few days after Richard Nixon's resignation and just a few days into Gerald Ford's tenure. The machinery of the executive branch had broken down for the handful of you who lived through 74. I certainly was there. In fact, I can remember exactly where I was when I found out that Nixon resigned. I was still a kid, and everybody had little transistor radios. And I remember being out at it was August, so I was out at some musical event in this open air pavilion in Chicago where I grew up, and people were all up against little transistor radios, and of course this was a big deal. This was the first time in history that an American president had resigned. So it was quite traumatic. Didn't have the trauma of something like September 11th, but it was very traumatic for that moment. And of course it followed the great turmoil of the Watergate break-in and all the investigations. And as I say, the machinery of the executive branch had broken down. There were all these investigations going on by the Department of Justice and the special prosecutors, all searching for Oval Office tape recordings and documents that had been demanded by the Watergate investigators. And a lot of former Nixon aides were scrambling to get out. But Antonin Scalia was trying to get in and move up higher. The staff of new President Ford issued orders to stop any shredding or burning of papers to try to make sure the potential evidence was not destroyed. And although he had resigned, Nixon still faced possible criminal charges related to the White House involvement in the June 17th break-in at the Watergate. It was the Democratic headquarters, as many of you know. So, but in this turmoil, Antonin Scalia found a home. He had originally been general counsel of what was then a new Office of Telecommunications Policy, and he had wanted to move up. He had gone to a smaller bureaucracy called the Administrative Conference, and wanted to become an assistant attorney general. But to give you a feel for what it was like then, Larry Silverman, who's now a judge on the DC Circuit, was at that time a deputy attorney general. And he wrote to his son, away at boarding school, a few months before the indictments of Nixon's top aides. This was spring of '74. Quote, "People high in the administration and high on the White House staff seem to be frantically looking to get out. As we can all understand, no matter how they were tied to Nixon or what their own political ambitions were, they just felt like this was a ship that was going down." But still, at this point, as I recount in the book, Justice Antonin Scalia, not yet Justice Scalia, of course, was 38 years old. He was ambitious, and he was moving to try to get himself positioned for something that would be a highly visible post. And he was very comfortable in conflict-rife situations. As I explain in the book, he really thrived in tense times. And if we don't get to it during the Q&A, if somebody would just remind me of what his own household was like when he was a kid, I think laid the ground for this. But during the prior 7 years, before he's pushing to get this job as an assistant attorney general, he had quit his prestigious job in a law firm just as he was about to be considered for partnership. Then he had shifted to a stint as a law professor at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. He packed up and moved to Washington to be part of Nixon's newly established Office of Telecommunications. Then he had moved to the Administrative Conference, as I mentioned, which is the small independent agency that used to exist to try to improve the management of the bureaucracy. And then he began looking for another job. And by late spring of '74, it looked like that job wasn't going to come through. And he told his wife Maureen and their then 7 children to go back to Charlottesville, but then just as the Nixon administration was collapsing, it appeared the job would come through in July, and he called his wife and said, "Don't unpack the boxes." So they all came right back to Washington. And for Scalia, this new job as an assistant attorney general would fundamentally shape his regard for the executive branch of government. It would bring him into the orbit of men who would be at the center of Republican politics for decades to come. Richard Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, were Nixon aides who became top aides then to Gerald Ford, and obviously still dominated during the presidency of George W. Bush. Nixon's longtime speechwriter, Patrick Buchanan, that name will be familiar to some people here, he was at the forefront of cultural conservatism at the time and certainly had definite ideas of what judges should be doing. He had a senior advisor role to Nixon and then to Ford. And as I saw in the archives of the I went to various presidential archives, Senate archives, and other libraries, Scalia solidified his view with these men that the executive had broad powers in important areas by default of sorts when the Constitution did not say otherwise. And I think that has certainly emerged in his rulings since then. His first assignment was amazing in the Office of Legal Counsel, and that was to write an opinion determining whether Nixon owned the tapes and documents that were being sought by Leon Jaworski, the special prosecutor. Now, key administration officials had already weighed in. Now, some of you remember from movies like All the President's Men, or what you've read in your history books, or what you've seen anywhere. Of course, you've got these White House tapes, and you've got all these documents. And as Scalia wrote in his memo, forever people have historically they were considered the papers of the president. And Richard Nixon wanted to move these papers with him to San Clemente. And it was sort of conventional wisdom among many people in the administration that he should be able to do that. But Ford decided he needed a formal legal opinion, and it was Scalia who he had to turn to as the Assistant Attorney General. And a man by the name of James Wilderotter, who worked in the Department of Justice at the time, said to me, welcome to the NFL, Nino, write the opinion on who owns the tapes. And but then Wilderotter also told me that if anyone was equipped to do that without the pressure, he'd been on the job for 2 weeks. Scalia had been on the job for 2 weeks, and he gets this huge assignment. He said Scalia could have done it. He said he was, he was intellectually gifted, loving argument for argument's sake, and when challenged, feisty to the point of flicking his fingers under his chin in that familiar Sicilian brush off. Scalia got in trouble for doing this a couple of years ago, and I said to this James Wilderotter, I said, well, did he do that a lot when you knew him? And he said, are you kidding? He was always doing that. So, as Wilderotter recalled, a mark of supreme disdain. So the 14th page opinion that Scalia shepherds through the process that ends up being revealed to the public under the signature of then Attorney General William Saxby concludes that the papers are Nixon's. And what Scalia writes is, to conclude that such materials are not the property of the former president would be to reverse what has apparently been the most unvaried understanding of all three branches of government since the beginning of the Republic. And he went on to talk about the institutional mindset of the executive branch, but what he didn't acknowledge, and of course it was reflected the tension of the time, was the constitutional crisis of the moment, and at the heart of this constitutional crisis were the records and tapes that were evidence of the cover-up. And as we know, Congress immediately countered this opinion that was written by Scalia and signed by Saxby on Nixon's ownership of the tapes with barely a second thought, and passed the 1974 Presidential Recordings and Material Preservation Act, ensuring that Nixon's papers were not turned over to him. And what I said to a class this afternoon, one of the best field trips in this area is to go to the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, and you can go listen to the Nixon tapes. You can even bring a little CBS tape and go copy them. So then you can ride around in your car and listen to the Nixon tapes, which actually are wonderful, because they're not just about Watergate. For me, they were quite helpful because this whole era of the taping system occurred as Nixon was actually choosing Supreme Court nominees. So it's just wonderful history to hear the president himself talking to his aides about who he wants for the Supreme Court, and talking to his aides about all sorts of issues of how he regards judicial selection and potential appointees. So as a result, the Nixon tapes have become the gift that keeps on giving, and certainly have helped me throughout my research for both the O'Connor book and for Scalia. But the episode to the man who would become Justice Scalia certainly taught him to jealously guard executive power, and in an atmosphere of distrust and suspicion, to consider Congress an adversary. One of my first research stops was the Senate Archive, which has all the testimony from Hill proceedings. And I know some of you have either done internships in Washington or will do internships on the Hill. And it's another great resource for anyone who's interested in politics and policy. And looking back on the numerous encounters that then Assistant Attorney General Scalia had on the Hill during the Ford years, I could see the additional seeds of Scalia's distrust for Congress. And I'll take you back to the fall of 1975, when, frankly, most of you were not even born yet. But this just shows the kind of man that Scalia became and the kind of justice he became. Democratic Senator Muskie was using his Senate Government Operations Committee to challenge Gerald Ford's assertion of executive power in many areas, executive privilege in many areas. You know, this is at a time when the CIA and national security activities were coming under a lot of scrutiny with the Pike and Church committees. And the post-Watergate mindset of Muskie and other Democrats in Congress was, we want information. We want documents, we want to know what's going on, and Ford officials were trying to jealously guard this. And here was one battle in what I consider a much larger war over the power of the respective branches of government. And it wasn't just about papers, it wasn't just about information, it was about who gets to know what and who gets to do what and what are the lines of power. And this was a battle that Scalia, with his rhetorical ability and philosophical commitment to the administration, was ready to take up. Quote, "I realize," Scalia testified to Muskie's committee, "that anyone saying a few kind words about executive privilege after the events of the last few years, Watergate, is in a position somewhat akin to the man preaching the virtues of water after the Johnstown flood, or the utility of fire after the burning of Chicago. But fire and water are, for all that, essential elements of human existence," end quote. Scalia was trying to fend off legislation that would have required the administration to keep congressional committees regularly informed about executive branch matters, including national security. And Scalia was firm that this was going to tie up the executive branch. And that legislation never went anywhere, but again, it was part of this whole struggle in this post-Watergate era. And when I talked to Justice Scalia about some of these exchanges, saying, you'd go up and all of Congress would be against what he wanted and against what the Ford administration was standing for at that time, because we just had all this crisis with Nixon. And I asked Scalia what it was like, and he said he recalled all these things with kind of a bring 'em on gusto, with a tone that suggested he felt like he had the superior position and was readier with rhetorical points than members of Congress, and essentially at one point said, "I could have done it with one arm tied behind my back." It doesn't quite sound that way when I go through the transcript. But as it turned out, Scalia's natural combativeness, political savvy, and allegiance to the executive were all ideally suited for this post-Watergate time. His authoritarian bent, rooted in his own rule-oriented father and Catholic upbringing, fostered his concern for the erosion of the executive branch and encroachments on the presidency. Yet Scalia's tenure in the Nixon and Ford administrations also made him a realist. Despite his preference for the executive, Scalia wrote, while he was an assistant attorney general, that the doctrine of executive privilege is, and probably should be, subject to the tugging of power between the branches of government. Scalia recognized that Congress had an arsenal of ways of getting people to talk. For example, by withholding action on nominations or other matters dear to the heart of the executive until the testimony was provided. So Scalia's time in the Ford administration had taught him that power belongs to the vigilant. He was learning to play the long game. And that's what my book is essentially about, how Justice Scalia played the long game of his time on the bench. His tenure, at a time when we probably will see another nomination this year, and we're just seeing how our most recent nominee appointee is doing, Sonia Sotomayor, his tenure provides an illuminating example of an unpredictable path to judicial prominence. He rode the conservative judicial revolution, associated not with Gerald Ford, but with Ronald Reagan, and after years as a dissenter, has now become a major voice in American law. He's increasingly in the majority on contentious cases, as I thought the Citizens United case really demonstrated. Through the force of his personality and his sense of mission and the play of recent politics, notably the two appointees by George W. Bush, Scalia has arrived at the apex of his power. A case in point, his 2008 decision for the majority that found an individual right to firearms in the Second Amendment of the Constitution. That's just sort of stunning. That was the first time in the history of the Supreme Court that it had said that there is a Second Amendment right to individual firearms, rather than a state militia right, for example, with the National Guard. And it was Justice Scalia who managed to hold on to the majority for that opinion. Chief Justice John Roberts assigned it to him in a way that was kind of a risk, because Justice Scalia has this way of writing that turns people off, but he kept everyone for that opinion, and I found that very notable. And of course, the decision in Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission of last month, ending distinctions between individuals and corporations in campaign finance regulation, will be part of his legacy. During the 4 years that I researched the justice's life and judicial tenure, I found that his own colleagues increasingly regarded him as a potent force. Justice Stevens told me, he's committed. He's made a huge difference. Some of it constructive, some of it unfortunate. Stevens, the senior liberal and the justice most likely to retire in the next couple of months, has dueled with Scalia countless times, from Bush v. Gore in 2000, which of course was the Florida election dispute that cut off the recounts. Scalia was with Bush, Stevens with Gore, to the recent dilemmas testing whether Guantanamo detainees may take their cases to U.S. judges. Scalia is against, Stevens for. Justice Ginsburg observed to me, he is in tune with many of the current generation of law students. When I was teaching in law school in the 70s, more students tended to be to the left than right of center. In the 80s and 90s, the conservative movement that was practically non-existent, she said, blossomed. And you'll see, I traced the emergence of the Federalist Society, something that was a group that was unheard of until we got to 1981 and 82, but is now quite a force on many campuses, and its rise was in parallel to Justice Scalia's rise. And in fact, he was a faculty advisor at the University of Chicago Law School for that branch of the Federalist Society. Justice Stephen Breyer, another liberal ideological opposite than Scalia, told me he's been struck by the energy and intellectual rigor Scalia brings to the job at age 73. And as Justice Clarence Thomas observed, he puts on his music and gets his computer ready. It's like he's conducting a symphony with majority opinions and dissents too. And one of my points of this book is that it used to be primarily in dissents, and it's not just in dissents anymore. The justice known for living large, from duck hunting with Dick Cheney to opera viewing with Justice Ginsburg. In fact, that's another thing if anybody wants to ask me about. I found that today, I was talking to a professor had known that Justice Scalia and Justice Ginsburg are best friends on the court. They're very much opposites, but yes, they are best friends on the court. He's got this big social life, out there on the speaking circuit, going to operas with Justice Ginsburg, duck hunting. He's produced a body of work that very much inspires conservatives. The core of his judicial philosophy, known as originalism, which is where the pun of the title comes from, is that the Constitution is fixed by its 18th century perspective, and it should be interpreted in light of how the drafters understood their times and the law. Scalia also narrowly reads federal rights, of course, opposes policies that take account of an individual's race, and is passionately against abortion rights. Scalia was shaped by his childhood in a first-generation home, a Sicilian home. He was born in Trenton and reared in Queens. Of Trenton, if anybody's here from New Jersey, he says, I hated Trenton. Now his aunt is he has one surviving aunt who became a great source for this, and she said, I wish he'd stop saying he hates Trenton, because she still lives there. But he then moved to Queens, and he loves Queens. He considers himself much more of a New Yorker than somebody from New Jersey, which I guess is natural, although Sam Alito from Trenton doesn't really appreciate that. But he grew up in Queens. As I like to say, he was not only an only child, he was the only offspring of his generation. His mother was one of 7 children. She was the only one that had kids. His father was one of 2. The sister didn't have any kids. So when he arrived on the scene, 7 years after his parents had been married, he was very much of a wanted child and the center of attention, and remained so, which I think tells you a little bit about his personality. So his father had come to America knowing very little English, and he earned a PhD at Columbia and spent 3 decades teaching Romance languages at Brooklyn College. The young Scalia, an only child, heeded the demands of his parents to excel academically. He was valedictorian in high school. He went to Xavier, if anybody knows the Manhattan Jesuit schools. He went to Xavier. He really tried to get into Regis, and to this day can tell me what exam questions he botched, which tells you something. He ends up at Xavier rather than at Regis, and then he goes on to becomes valedictorian. And then he becomes first in his class at Georgetown University, and then graduates from Harvard Law School. He taught before and after his time in the Nixon and Ford administrations, most of the time with the University of Chicago. And he had his setbacks. This was the thing I found interesting. I had been watching Justice Scalia for ages. I started covering the court in '89, 3 years after he had come on. And because I was with Congressional Quarterly in my early years, I really was watching what he was doing in terms of a textualist, looking at the work of Congress. So I've been watching him, and then I've watched him, especially as a political force during my time at the Post. But I had not realized, I had always thought that he had a pretty charmed life, and I still believe that, but it was interesting to see his setbacks. You know, he still remembers the high school one. He really wanted to go to Princeton, didn't get into Princeton, ends up at Georgetown, obviously no slouch school. And then the thing that was really a bummer for him is that he really thought he was going to become the U.S. Solicitor General under Reagan. He had, now that job, for any of you who know, I've just quoted Elena Kagan, who's currently our Solicitor General. That's the government's top lawyer before the Supreme Court. Until it became Elena Kagan, the first woman to hold that spot, it was all men, and they wore the morning suits, you know, with the gray suits with tails, and, you know, very, very dignified position, very high-profile position. And Justice Scalia thought he was going to get that. He interviewed with then Attorney General William Friend Smith, and found out that he didn't, and it was a real blow because he just didn't believe, he actually thought he had an in for it, and everything that I had heard at the time was that he was very close to a finalist. It went to a man by the name of Rex Lee, for those of you who might remember those Reagan years. But it was a setback that seared him, and he said to me in one of our interviews, I was bitterly disappointed. I never forget it. And in fact, this was in 81, 82. In 1986, when Ed Meese, then Attorney General, called him and said, Ronald Reagan wants to talk to you about the Supreme Court, Justice Scalia told no one but his wife. He was so afraid that the same thing was going to happen, that he would go and meet with Reagan, and Reagan would say, I'll go with this other guy. But what happened was he goes and he talks to Reagan, and Reagan says to him, they have a very good conversation, and Reagan says, I'm thinking of appointing you to the Supreme Court. Would you want that job? And Scalia said, yes, I'll take it. So he was not going to let anything happen in the intervening time. And of course, Reagan loved the first generation Italian-American story of Scalia. Reagan first, of course, named Scalia to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. That was in 1982. And then he elevates him in 86. Now, some legal analysts in 86 predicted that Scalia, who was then a very charming presence on the Washington social circuit, playing poker with power brokers from both sides of the political spectrum, and as I said, you know, already going to the opera with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, that he would become a legendary magnetic force like, for example, William Brennan, who was a liberal, but he was known for crafting coalitions for a majority. But Brennan, unlike what Scalia was going to do in those early years, acquiesced often on the law. His idea was, I'm going to get 5 votes. I don't care how I get these 5 votes. I'll work with people to compromise. Justice Scalia showed no interest in compromises in the 80s and 90s, and as a result, his voice was heard largely in dissents that became battle cries for the right wing. More than any other justice of his time, Scalia then and now will take his show on the road to talk about constitutional issues and to express moral judgments in public forums outside the court in very attention-getting ways. If he were in this room, well, first of all, if you were coming, you wouldn't have held it here. You would be over in the Union or the ballroom or whatever, and people would be hanging from the rafters. Even on liberal campuses, when he went to Ann Arbor at the University of Michigan, where lots of people weren't going to agree with his philosophy, it was like going to a rock concert, people say. You know, because he just has that engaging force, and that's what's made him effective, despite a lot of people disagreeing with him. I should mention that Ruth Bader Ginsburg told me, when I asked her, do you remember when you first met him? And she did. It was in the 70s when she was teaching at Columbia, and she said, I was listening to his speech. I disagreed with everything he said, but I was enchanted. I mean, there's just something about his force, you know, in terms of the intellectual nature and his way of expressing it that is very effective. Interestingly, when I started this project in 2006, after I'd done the O'Connor book, I thought I would be focusing on Scalia's dissenter and how he got his message out beyond the marble walls. But face it, you know, the appointments of Chief Justice John Roberts and Samuel Alito then to succeed Sandra Day O'Connor really have made a difference on this court. The Roberts Court is not likely to go as far as Scalia wants on some social issues. For example, to forbid all race-based discrimination or overturn the right to abortion. But his views are prevailing on campaign finance, the Second Amendment, and increasingly on more hot-button issues. Elena Kagan, who was Harvard Law Dean until last year before becoming the U.S. Solicitor General, called Scalia in 2007, quote, the justice who has had the most important impact over the years in how we think and talk about the law. So even as Democrats control the White House and Congress, the Supreme Court remains a bastion of conservatism. President Obama's first appointee, Justice Sotomayor, replaced liberal Justice David Souter. And the justice most likely to retire, of course, John Paul Stevens, is likely to be replaced by someone who votes just like him. So Justice Scalia, that'll be a wash, and the conservatives will still control, and it's likely that Justice Scalia will find himself increasingly in the majority. He will also certainly continue to promote his originalist constitutional theory. When I remarked to Justice Scalia in one of our last interviews for the book that he had been writing more and more and getting the opportunity to author more significant opinions, he made clear that he wasn't entirely satisfied. The wins, he sighed, the wins, damn few. He will turn 74 next month, and that's young in justice years, as many of you know. And despite the fact that he still smokes, drinks, and eats a lot, I think he will have many more years on the bench. As the Citizens United case demonstrated 3 weeks ago, his imprint on the law is becoming deeper with each year. His legacy, which has some of its roots in the Nixon administration, Ford administration, and obviously in the Reagan administration, is likely to only become more sweeping and potent in upcoming years, for better or for worse. Thank you.